Here is what we know. According to multiple reports breaking today from CBS News and corroborated by statements from DHS officials, the Department of Homeland Security is experiencing what sources are calling a complete organizational restructuring in the wake of the Minneapolis enforcement crisis. DHS Secretary Christy Noem is being reassigned from her role overseeing interior deportation enforcement to a position focused on southern border operations. According to CBS News sources, this reassignment occurred following a White House meeting on Monday evening where Noem faced direct questioning about her department's handling of recent events in Minneapolis, Minnesota. The reassignment follows the removal of Border Patrol Commander Chief Greg Bovino from his position in Minneapolis. According to reporting from The Atlantic and confirmed by DHS sources, Bovino is set to retire following his departure from Minnesota operations. Sources within the administration describe Bovino as a cowboy whose presence was only escalation. Federal Judge Patrick Schiltz, the chief federal judge in Minnesota, has issued an order compelling ICE Acting Director Todd Lyons to appear personally in court this Friday. According to the court order, Judge Schiltz is threatening Lyons with contempt charges for failure to comply with dozens of court orders in recent weeks. The judge's written order states, "This is one of dozens of court orders with which respondents have failed to comply in recent weeks. The practical consequence of respondents' failure to comply has almost always been significant hardship to aliens, many of whom have lawfully lived and worked in the United States for years and done absolutely nothing wrong." The order continues. The court has been extremely patient with respondents, even though respondents decided to send thousands of agents to Minnesota to detain aliens without making any provision for dealing with the hundreds of habeas petitions and other lawsuits that were sure to result. Judge Schiltz concluded, "The court's patience is at an end. Accordingly, the court will order Todd Lyons, the acting director of ICE, to appear personally before the court and show cause why he should not be held in contempt of court." According to DHS Press Secretary Tricia McLaughlin speaking on Fox News, the administration maintains that enforcement operations in Minneapolis encountered a highly coordinated campaign of violence against law enforcement. However, when pressed by Fox News anchor Dana Perino on whether the administration stands by labeling individuals involved as domestic terrorists, McLaughlin deferred to ongoing investigations by Homeland Security investigators, the FBI, and CBP's internal review. The administration dispatched Tom Homan to Minneapolis on Monday morning, effectively removing Christy Noem from operational oversight of the Minneapolis situation. According to sources cited in reporting this move, came after the president determined the situation was, quote, fucked and needed immediate intervention. Senator John Fetterman, Democrat from Pennsylvania, issued a public appeal on social media directly to the president stating, "I make a direct appeal to immediately fire Secretary Christy Noem. Americans have died. She is betraying DHS's core mission and trashing your border security legacy." Reports from multiple sources indicate that ICE has been transporting individuals apprehended in Minnesota to Texas, reprocessing them through border facilities, and then releasing them without providing means for return transportation. Presidential communications to Minnesota, Governor Tim Walz, and Minneapolis Mayor Jacob Frey occurred this week, according to sources, as the administration attempts to de-escalate tensions with state and local officials who had explicitly objected to the federal enforcement surge. But here is what they aren't telling you. This is not a story about immigration enforcement gone wrong. This is a story about institutional collapse happening in real-time broadcast to the entire world. Let's be precise about what just occurred. The federal government deployed thousands of enforcement agents into an American city against the explicit objections of every level of elected government in that jurisdiction. The operation was executed without legal infrastructure to handle the predictable judicial response. And when confronted with the consequences, the administration's first instinct was not accountability, it was propaganda. 3 senior officials, Greg Bovino, Christy Noem, and Stephen Miller, made public statements in the immediate aftermath that are now demonstrably contradicted by available evidence. Bovino claimed an individual wanted to do maximum damage and massacre law enforcement. Noem called it an act of domestic terrorism. Miller described a domestic terrorist tried to assassinate federal law enforcement. These were not off-the-cuff remarks. These were coordinated talking points delivered within hours, designed to establish a narrative before facts could emerge. The real implication is this: when a federal chief judge uses language like, "the court's patience is at an end," that is not standard judicial rhetoric. That is a warning shot. Judge Schiltz is signaling that the executive branch has systematically ignored court orders not once, not twice, but dozens of times. This is contempt becoming policy. And here is the mechanism they are not explaining. The administration sent enforcement teams into Minnesota with no legal support structure, no capacity to respond to habeas petitions, no coordination with federal courts, no plan for due process. They engineered a constitutional crisis and then expressed surprise when the judiciary pushed back. The reassignment of Christy Noem is being framed as a routine adjustment. Let's call it what it is: a desperate attempt to create the appearance of accountability without actual accountability. She is not being fired. She is not resigning. She is being moved laterally to a position where she can claim she is no longer responsible for interior enforcement while retaining her cabinet position and salary. Greg Bovino is retiring. How convenient. No investigation, no congressional testimony, just a quiet exit while the administration hopes the news cycle moves on. But the judiciary is not cooperating with that timeline. Todd Lyons, the acting director of ICE, is now facing personal contempt charges, not the agency, him personally. This is a federal judge saying, "You will appear in my courtroom and you will explain why you should not be held legally responsible for institutional disobedience." So what happens when the courts start holding executive officials in contempt? That is the question no one in the administration wants to answer, because the answer exposes the fragility of their entire approach. They assumed they could overwhelm local opposition through force. They assumed they could control the narrative through coordinated messaging. They assumed the courts would be slow procedural deferential. They were wrong on all three counts. And who benefits from this miscalculation? Every adversary watching American governance right now is seeing a federal government that cannot coordinate between its own branches. A federal government that deploys enforcement resources without legal planning. A federal government that makes public statements contradicted by evidence within 72 hours. This is not just a domestic political problem. This is a competency signal. And in geopolitics, competency signals determine who has leverage at the negotiating table. The administration wanted to project strength through enforcement. What they actually projected was chaos through incompetence. And the entire world is taking notes. When Fox News anchors are pressing DHS officials with skeptical questions, that tells you the narrative has completely collapsed. Fox News built its brand on supporting executive authority during immigration enforcement. When they start asking whether the domestic terrorist label still stands, they are signaling that even friendly media outlets cannot defend the administration's position anymore. The DHS press secretary's response is revealing. She does not defend the characterization. She does not provide new evidence. She defers to ongoing investigations. That is the sound of an administration retreating from its own rhetoric while trying to avoid explicitly admitting error. But here is the structural problem they cannot solve. The judicial orders exist. The contempt hearing is scheduled. The reassignments are public. The contradictions are documented. You cannot memory hole a constitutional confrontation once federal judges are issuing written orders threatening executive officials with legal consequences. And this creates a cascading credibility problem. If the administration backed down in Minnesota, where else will they back down? If they mischaracterized events this significantly in Minneapolis, what else are they mischaracterizing? If their cabinet officials are being reassigned for operational failures, how many other failures are being concealed? These are the questions foreign governments are asking right now, and they are adjusting their strategies accordingly. Now let's connect this to the international chessboard, because this is where the Minneapolis crisis becomes a geopolitical gift to American adversaries. Mark Carney just became Prime Minister of Canada. His entire electoral strategy was built on economic nationalism and reducing Canadian dependence on American supply chains. He ran on renegotiating USMCA, the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. He ran on diversifying Canadian trade relationships. He ran on positioning Canada as a more reliable partner than an increasingly unpredictable United States. And what just landed in his lap? A live demonstration of American institutional dysfunction, a federal government that cannot enforce its own laws without triggering judicial revolt, a cabinet in chaos, officials being reassigned mid-crisis, a president calling governors to de-escalate situations his own administration created. So what does Carney do with this information when USMCA renegotiations begin? He points to Minneapolis. He says, this is who you are asking us to integrate our economy with. A government that deploys federal agents against the will of state officials. A government whose cabinet members make false public statements. A government that cannot coordinate between executive agencies and federal courts. And suddenly Canada's position in trade negotiations is exponentially stronger because the perception of instability reduces American leverage. Why would Canada make concessions to a government that appears unable to maintain internal coherence? But this goes beyond Canada. China has been watching American governance closely for signs of systemic weakness. Not military weakness, not economic weakness, governance weakness, the ability of the American system to make decisions, implement policy, and maintain institutional coordination. And what did they just observe? A federal enforcement operation that collapsed under judicial pressure within days. A cabinet secretary reassigned because her department could not handle the fallout from its own actions. A federal judge threatening to hold an ICE director in contempt for systematically ignoring court orders. This is intelligence gold for Beijing because it reveals operational limitations. If the American federal government cannot execute a domestic enforcement operation without triggering institutional crisis, how confident should Beijing be in American commitments abroad? Think about this through the lens of Taiwan contingency planning. The United States has made security commitments to Taiwan. Those commitments assume American institutional capacity to mobilize coordinate across agencies and execute complex operations under pressure. But what if Beijing's assessment is that American institutions are more fragile than previously calculated? The Minneapolis crisis does not change American military capabilities, but it changes the perception of American governance capacity. And in deterrence theory, perception is reality. If adversaries believe you lack the institutional coherence to follow through on commitments, your commitments lose credibility. And here is where tariffs enter the equation. The administration has threatened tariffs as a negotiation tool with multiple countries. Tariffs work as leverage when the threatening party is perceived as stable and willing to endure economic pain to achieve objectives. But what happens when trading partners perceive the threatening party as internally chaotic? They call the bluff. They wait. They calculate that an administration under domestic pressure, with cabinet officials being reassigned with federal judges issuing contempt threats, is an administration that cannot sustain a prolonged trade conflict. So China waits, Canada waits, the European Union waits. They watch the Minneapolis crisis unfold. They watch the cabinet reshuffling. They watch the judicial confrontations, and they recalculate their negotiating positions accordingly. Because leverage is not just about economic capacity. Leverage is about perceived willingness and ability to follow through. And the Minneapolis crisis just broadcast to the world that the current administration struggles with follow-through when confronted with institutional resistance. Let's game this out further. Imagine you are a foreign minister in a country currently negotiating with the United States. You are being asked to make concessions on trade, on military cooperation, on intelligence sharing. You are being told that partnership with the United States provides stability and security. And then you watch Minneapolis happen. You watch a domestic enforcement operation trigger a multi-branch governmental crisis. You watch cabinet officials deliver false information to the public. You watch a federal judge threaten an executive official with contempt. What is your updated assessment of American institutional reliability? You start hedging. You start exploring alternative partnerships. You start building redundancy into your strategic planning. Because you have just observed that American governance can experience rapid, unpredictable institutional conflict. This is exactly what adversaries want. Not American military defeat, not American economic collapse, American strategic isolation, the slow erosion of alliance confidence, the gradual realization among partners that the United States is becoming a higher risk, more unpredictable, less reliable partner. And Minneapolis just accelerated that process. because this was not a foreign policy failure. This was a domestic operation. If the administration cannot manage a domestic enforcement action without triggering institutional revolt, how will they manage complex international crisis scenarios? The answer being calculated in capitals around the world is they probably cannot. And that calculation changes everything. Here is the historical precedent that matters. Empires do not fall because they lose wars. Empires fall because their institutional coherence deteriorates, their allies lose confidence, and their adversaries perceive exploitable weakness. The Roman Empire did not fall to a single military defeat. It fell to decades of institutional decay, border pressure, and the gradual defection of peripheral regions that no longer believed in Roman capacity to maintain order. The Minneapolis crisis is not the fall of American power, but it is the kind of institutional failure that accelerates the perception of decline. And in international relations, perception of decline becomes self-fulfilling. Allies hedge, adversaries probe. The burden of maintaining commitments increases precisely as the perception of capacity to meet those commitments decreases. Now extrapolate forward 6 months. USMCA renegotiations are underway. Mark Carney's government is demanding revisions. The administration wants to project strength. But everyone in the room remembers Minneapolis. Everyone in the room knows about the cabinet reshuffling. Everyone in the room has read Judge Schiltz's contempt order. How much leverage does the American negotiating team actually have? Less than they think. Because the Minneapolis crisis created a reference point, a vivid, recent, well-documented example of American institutional dysfunction. And that reference point will be invoked subtly or explicitly every time the administration tries to make demands at the negotiating table. You want us to accept these terms? The same administration that could not coordinate a domestic enforcement operation without judicial intervention? The same administration whose cabinet officials are being reassigned for operational failures? That is the question being prepared in foreign ministries right now, and it is a devastatingly effective negotiating counter because it forces the American team to either defend Minneapolis, which is indefensible, or acknowledge dysfunction, which undermines their negotiating authority. This is what strategic weakness looks like in the 21st century, not military defeat, not economic depression, institutional incoherence broadcast in real time, analyzed by adversaries, and weaponized in future negotiations. And the administration cannot undo it. Because the court orders are public, the judicial contempt hearing is scheduled, the cabinet reassignments are documented, the false statements are archived, the entire sequence is now part of the permanent record available to any foreign government seeking to undermine American negotiating positions. So here is the final question. If a single domestic enforcement operation can trigger this level of institutional crisis, this degree of international credibility, damage this much ammunition for adversaries, what happens during the next real crisis? What happens when there is an actual international emergency requiring rapid coordination between executive agencies, congressional support, judicial deference, and allied confidence? Will American institutions perform better under higher stakes, or has Minneapolis revealed that the current system struggles with coordination under any significant pressure? That is the question keeping allied governments awake at night. And it is the question adversaries are hoping gets answered the way they expect. Because if Minneapolis is the baseline for American institutional performance, then every commitment, every alliance, every deterrence posture is built on a foundation more fragile than previously understood. And that changes everything about how the next decade of geopolitics will unfold. Do you think foreign governments are recalculating their strategy based on Minneapolis? Or are domestic failures irrelevant to international credibility?